Now, before we continue, we should probably talk about Roscoe Conkling, James G. Blaine, and kind of what was going on post-Civil War, for the most part. Things were very interesting within the Republican Party and Democratic Party, too. But I'll probably get more into that when I get into the next episode with Grover Cleveland. I probably touched on this only a little bit, for the most part, on Ulysses S. Grant, and, in the previous episodes specifically, Hayes and all that. Post-Civil War, America is very Republican-dominated, and it's quite interesting to really conceptualize, to be quite honest with you. Excuse me. Think about it. It's really just one-party rule in a lot of ways for the better part of a decade, like genuine, dominant one-party rule. The Republicans basically had everything. The Democrats really, obviously, for many reasons, the rebels themselves, just didn't have any power. They didn't have really any say of the direction the country was going to be going, which is a good and a bad thing. The good in the sense that, no slavery, et cetera, and we're going to actually push for genuine real civil rights, or at the very least attempt to. In fairness, a lot of it was genuine and a lot of it was a facade, depending on your political leanings within the Republican Party, I guess you could say. It's also bad too because one party control, that's very dangerous. The whole functional purpose of our constitutional republic ultimately is checks and balances. It's the disruption of complete and total power, which could devolve into straight up authoritarianism. And, back then, the Republican Party for 10 years had a chance to really, shape the country. And again, I always make this point too, because this is a big reason why I'm not a Republican or a Democrat personally. I don't have really any particular political leanings. I just like history, and then I'm anti-corruption for the most part. That's probably the one thing I would probably think about. But for the most part, my whole point being that, for 10 years, once basically Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and aside from the Andrew Johnson presidency, it's really just Republicans trying to reshape America, and the country that came of it was interesting. A lot of productive development of technology, business, commerce, et cetera, and above all else, insane levels of corruption. And here's the thing: I always think it's interesting because Republicans always want to point to, they are the party of Abraham Lincoln. And it's like, yeah, you were the party of Abraham Lincoln, but that was 4.5 years, really, and you have decades upon decades upon decades of problems and issues, especially post-Lincoln, which, no one really talks about. And the reason why I bring this up is because there's the growing struggle between political factions within specific parties, Democrats, Republicans, but most notably Republicans, because they're the controlling party. They're the ones that are going to be predominantly and ultimately in power, really, from basically from Abraham Lincoln's presidency all the way up until Taft leaves office. There's only 2 Democratic presidents, and in total it's about 11 years of a term, or 11 years or well, technically speaking, 14 or 12 years of a presidency. It's basically just Andrew Johnson and Grover Cleveland for the most part. Those are the only 2 Democrat presidents that this country's had. Aside from that, they've basically just had Republican after Republican after Republican after Republican. And, it's a weird power struggle between 2 factions of similar but very differing political ideologies. And it's really interesting to really think about. And I brought it up briefly with, I think, Grant, and I think with Rutherford B. Hayes and some of the other Republican presidents, but the people that are considered, half-breeds and stalwarts within the Republican Party. Now, if you're wondering what those actually are, specifically speaking, by definition, half-breeds within the Republican Party, led by the senator from Maine, James G. Blaine, who's basically Garfield's Secretary of State for like 5 months before he's assassinated, and then I believe he will be Benjamin Harrison's Secretary of State when he becomes president himself, I think a decade later, for the most part, or about a decade later, like 8 years later. And then The half-breeds specifically were considered half-breeds because they were considered half loyal and half for reform. Meaning specifically they were half loyal to, at the time, President Ulysses S. Grant, and then half loyal to what would be specifically civil service reform. And specifically, they were fully loyal to nobody, to no ideology, or to no real person, for the most part. Support's one thing, but ultimately that whatever, at the very least on the onset, because there's issues with the half-breeds themselves, most of them being exceptional radicals, they wanted reform. They wanted to actually do what was better for the party and for the country, ultimately, for the most part. And, in some ways you can think of them as like one of the weird first populist movements in America. I wouldn't really consider them that, but there's that potential for them there. The populist movement I would get to a little bit later when I get to the beginning of Chester A. Arthur's presidency. Anyways, the stalwarts specifically were people who were had their stalwart support, as one book had actually put it, for Ulysses S. Grant, the patronage system, and all those little things and machinations that ultimately led to, really party strength within the federal government, but also potential corruption too, that ultimately leads to a lot of issues and a lot of problems. And it's very interesting because the person who led the stalwarts ultimately is a man named Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling is really interesting, and he's going to be one of Arthur's, I guess you could say, interesting companions in a lot of ways. And this is going to be very interesting to Arthur's story. Conkling himself is a really weird dude, really corrupt dude, but ultimately just a guy who just had a lot of power. Apparently he was a really big man, like 6'3". He's pretty broad, pretty strong. Was an avid boxer, actually, fought a lot, and always dressed in nice clothes and all that stuff and all that jazz, and really was a very fascinating man. The more you dig deep into him, the more it's very, very clear that he's ruthless, he's a bit monstrous, and in a lot of ways, some things get tied to him that some true and some probably not true, and you don't know. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's not shocking if, say, he potentially put a hit out on James A. Garfield. Or, that's probably highly unlikely, but who knows? Things are still very finicky, to be quite honest with you, with a lot of things that happen within this government and within our own country's history. And power and corruption rules above all else. But I just wanted to point that out before we get really started back into the nitty-gritty of Chester A. Arthur. Anyways, Arthur, he post-Civil War is really focusing on his law firm. He's focusing on a whole bunch of different things. His family, for one thing, he's trying to, but he's making himself busy for basically status, finances, etc., etc. His wife is a little bit upset, obviously. They lost their first kid, and then things are very difficult, ultimately. A lot of these guys who really focus on their work, etc., etc., to really push for themselves, status, position, etc., all that stuff. You tend to leave certain things behind, unfortunately, which is just what ends up happening most of the time. And, the family life would be really tenuous and difficult at times, especially around this particular period before Arthur really gets himself into the political game and the political machinations that really dominate his life in the 1880s. But, post-Civil War, 1865 to, let's say, 1868, things are going pretty good for him. He's whining and dining people. It's really weird. Every single president has weird and unique personalities. Every single one of them does. Some people tend to be much more radical. It's interesting, what I'm saying. Obama's boring, for instance, but, he's also someone that, the way he talks, the way he communicates with you is really much more thoroughly fascinating and kind of interesting. Boring, but, you're not going to say that Obama is like this insanely uninteresting individual or someone who has no personality. He does have something like that. I'll get to that when I get to Obama, at the very least. But, other presidents are very unique, very different. And Chester A. Arthur really isn't any different. His personality really starts to shine here. He's not really anyone that's, he's the best way I could probably describe it, to be quite honest with you, is that he's someone that ultimately wants to avoid an argument as much as possible. He's really passive in a lot of ways, and passive is probably not the right word. He's just someone that's he's just not a really non-confrontational kind of individual in person, which is good and bad. Because, I always tend to think if you're not a confrontational person, then you're probably not going to really get anywhere. But in the system that he was in the places that he was going, and the people that he was working with, non-confrontation ultimately really worked ultimately in his benefit. Now, the former governor, Mr. Edwin D. Morgan, who helped him get a whole bunch of different things and during the Civil War, the quartermaster positions, and et cetera, he's now the senator for the state of New York, and he has a lot of power, a lot of pull. He's a stalwart, ultimately, and he's basically, in a lot of ways, the leader or the representative of the Stalwart Party in New York, although a man who's kind of riding those coattails right behind him, and Roscoe Conkling. Excuse me. And it's around this time, too, that Chester A. Arthur really starts to focus on the party and the politics ultimately that go along with it. For a couple years, he's effectively... Well, first and foremost, he's trying to get some other positions. He's not trying to get that whole Customs House thing, but he's trying to get a position at the U.S. Customs House, but unfortunately it was all patronage, et cetera, and Morgan really wasn't trying to, seem, at the very least, as politically, we'll get this person who really hasn't earned it and who's clearly getting, it's one of those things where, Edwin Morgan had too many people to give too many different positions, and Arthur was kind of one of the just, if we have something, we'll give it to you. He was in that kind of position and in that particular situation. Now for Arthur, like I said before, despite him having some leanings towards more of the half-breed, much more of the radical perspective and position within the Republican Party, and ideologically speaking, he ultimately decided to go with the stalwarts. They were a bit too radical, probably a bit too confrontational, and ultimately, because Morgan was a stalwart too, really worked under his wing. But basically, once Morgan's focusing on more national politics and stuff like that, and the actual U.S. Senate, Conkling ends up becoming the next guy in line within New York. He ends up getting elected, I think, into the state Senate in 1867. Remember, Andrew Johnson's the president by this point in time, and all that stuff's happening while Chester A. Arthur is slowly rising through the ranks. Again, always interesting to think about, just the rise that these guys end up having sometimes. But for Chester A. Arthur, for Conkling specifically, Chester A. Arthur is the kind of guy that you kind of want. Dutiful, prideful in his work, does really good work, and ultimately is someone that you can trust in a lot of ways. And Conkling, once he gets elected to the state Senate, is effectively the leader of the Republican Party, the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. Chester A. Arthur ends up really getting an opportunity and really goes under his wing and really helps focus on what the stalwart ideas in New York are really pushing. And it's around this time, 1867, 1868, Ulysses S. Grant makes his run at the presidency, and Chester A. Arthur basically is doing a whole bunch of different fundraisers, a whole bunch of different campaign. He's campaigning effectively for Ulysses S. Grant around 1867, 1868 during his election. Grant's going to win, and he's going to win 1868, I believe, the presidency, and ultimately, although New York, I believe, went Democrat or was very close to being Democrat. Tammany Hall still pretty prominent in New York around this time too, and for basically Chester A. Arthur, things are looking really good. They have a lot of power. The Republicans, I think, still controlled the state legislature, and things were looking really good at the very least for young Chester A. Arthur, or middle-aged Chester A. Arthur, effectively. He would serve as the chief counsel to the New York Tax Commission, basically just controlling how taxes operated, and got paid a lot of money. It's always interesting when books and a whole bunch of articles end up pointing out, he got paid $10,000, and I just think, I don't know, I find that really interesting. But in fairness, that's a lot of money. I think most skilled labor people effectively got paid like $500-600 a year, and that was a lot of money. And back then he's living very comfortably. He's gonna own that brick house in New York very comfortably. Is probably the best way I could feasibly explain it. But anyways, things are only looking up for Chester A. Arthur. A couple years and working with the party, because he's focusing now at this point most of his time in politics. Since he's getting most of his money through politics, he's effectively stopped his law firm. I mean, his partner died, and it was basically just a solo firm for a little bit. And he's just going to focus entirely on the Republican Party, and which is good because his wife got to see him a little bit more. More kids were coming on the way, and things were looking up and coming for Chester A. Arthur. 1869, 1870s, things are going up and down within New York itself. You guys remember, within like 5 years and the Rutherford B. Hayes election, New York's going to go blue. It's going to go very Democrat. So things are changing, and you have to keep that in mind as Chester Arthur is really going up, at least within the Republican Party itself, and getting a lot of good praise. A lot of people are kind of liking Chester A. Arthur. He's very passive. He's not someone you're going to start a fight with. He's kind of just chill. You can vibe with Chester Arthur. He's always dressing nice, always kind of just like really nitpicky with his outfits and whatnot. But, for the most part, Chester Arthur seems like someone who's gonna do good. And at face value, he's someone that can hold specific positions and not be this super corrupt person. So 1870 to 1871, Grant is gonna appoint Arthur to the most prestigious position, probably within the country, to the position of the collector of the Port of New York. Now, the collector of the Port of New York, understand, is basically the main area that will effectively deal with the overwhelming majority of the nation's imports, taxes, etc., etc. Is this good stuff? Is this bad stuff? Yada yada. What's going to come into this country? What's going to leave the country? And what's going to he's going to be the guy that's going to be leading most of it. Effectively, he's like the CEO of it in a lot of ways. His specific position was to hire a lot of people. He would effectively end up hiring, for relatively speaking, about 1,300 individuals, agents they're called, to collect all the importation duties, etc., and make sure everything was up and dandy. Okay? And for him, this is a very prestigious position. Numbers. Okay, money, etc. He's going to be living very lavishly. I think because it's a monetary system specifically, I guess you could say it's perks. I'll put it to you, because he was supposed to get paid like $12,000 a year with this specific and prestigious position, but ultimately with undervalued imports, etc., all these fines that are off the books, etc., he's probably making close to $50,000 a year. He's making more than the damn president. Great. And I'm just saying, man, a lot of these people are really corrupt individuals, but even the best of them, even men like Chester Arthur, come on, like he lived a very lavish lifestyle, etc., and I definitely don't like, but at the very same end of the spectrum, I understand, but I don't like the corruption aspect of it ultimately. And he ultimately really held a lot of power and a lot of whim, and specifically he held a lot of power and a lot of control because he was basically backed by Roscoe Conkling, and there's this little internal civil war that one of his biographies talks about. There's a couple articles. I actually think the Wikipedia page probably sums it up the best, to be honest with you. But use Wikipedia at your own peril. There's a lot of difficulties. There's the stalwart faction. This guy previously, who was a half-breed, I believe, held the actual initial position for quite a long time. But then he started replacing people with his own half-breed, agents, I guess you could say, which pissed off Roscoe Conkling, and then it's a bit of an internal struggle, an internal battle. Politics is really interesting around this particular point in time. It doesn't really get talked about, and I kind of am really interested to see if like a movie would be made or a documentary about it. But it's really interesting, and I think you should. Anyone who's listening to this should actually look it up at your own for your own interest. But specifically, Arthur, once he goes in, he's just basically hiring people left and right, and creates, unintentionally and intentionally, one of the more corrupt, I guess you could say, ports of New York. One of the tax importations with basically in this country's history. Basically every single customs agent was basically accepting bribes from importers, warehouse owners, ship companies, and again, a lot of books always like to point out that Arthur there's no evidence that he specifically, directly, was specifically bribed. But at the same time, it's like, okay, but you can't make $50,000 a year when your salary's 10. Come on, man. Like, you can't make 5 times your income. So Arthur's going to hold this position basically for the entire decade, from basically 1870 to, I believe, around 1880. In 10 years, the system became really, really corrupt in a lot of ways. There are some internal investigations when the midterm elections come during Grant's presidency. A lot of stalwart Republicans get kicked out. A lot more of the liberal Republican half-breeds kind of get in a little bit. They really want civil service reform. And, Arthur ends up getting caught in a lot of ways with a lot of his political machinations, ultimately. That leads to a clearly one-sided, corrupt machine that he's intentionally and, again, unintentionally created. Excuse me. And things with him started toning down a little bit. He couldn't take any more bribes. His salary's back down to $12,000 a year, around 1875, 1876. And things are looking a little bit up and down. Like I said, a whole bunch of different things are happening. A whole bunch of different gears. People are making moves, etc., etc. New York is becoming specifically more democratic. Partially for numerous reasons. Ultimately, because the Republican Party is really corrupt in New York, and a lot of people see through that. And, there's a reason why Samuel J. Tilden, I believe it was Tilden, who's going to be the guy who's going to really break the whole corruption ring. He's the guy that is going to go into Hayes during his presidential run. They just wanted to stop the corruption, ultimately. And New York isn't as strongly Republican as a lot of people think it is, although it's still strong because Conkling's a big national figure by this point. A lot of things are going their way, at the very least, because Conkling might make a run at the presidency. I think he attempts it because Grant's retiring from the presidency. He's leaving after 2 terms, and things are looking very sketchy for Chester A. Arthur. If Conkling is able to make a real run and make it in as the president, then Arthur's safe. But if he doesn't, and whether it's Hayes or whether it's Tilden, either way, it's going to go bad. Ultimately, Conkling doesn't get the nomination. It's going to be Rutherford B. Hayes as the compromise candidate. And it's very immediately known that regardless of what Hayes ideologically and politically is, ultimately, it's looking like there's going to be some attempt at civil service reform, if at the very least just to distance himself from the Grant administration and to all the problems that really happened because of that, and that this election ultimately is going to be about civil service reform. And for Chester A. Arthur, it's not looking too good. And then once Rutherford B. Hayes gets into political office, Hayes and Chester A. Arthur, they're going to come into some conflict. Well, relatively speaking, they're going to come into some conflict. Now, by this point, though, Chester A. Arthur is a relatively well-known individual, at least within the Republican Party. He hasn't really held any specific, offices for the most part, but, he's held very important positions within the federal government, and he has a standing, at the very least, as one of the top dogs, one of the top lieutenants of Roscoe Conkling, and, he's basically a very just well-known individual. The best way I could probably explain it is kind of like the most important understudy of someone who's like, who's the understudy of like the most important, well-known political. It's basically like the underdog of, like, say, Mitch McConnell. It's kind of like that. I guess you could say, or Joe Biden. Who knows? Like the number 2 guy to that, ultimately, that does all the dirty work and holds a lot of low-key important positions that should just be of note. Anyways, again, he's a very well-known political figure, and I understand too. He's like in his mid-40s around this point in time, mid to late 40s, and life is just going for Chester A. Arthur, family, etc., etc. He's basically living in wealth, relatively speaking. But things are going to drastically change when Rutherford B. Hayes gets into the presidency, into the administration. Immediately, like legitimately immediately from the get-go, Rutherford B. Hayes, kind of, but not really, John Sherman, the Treasury Secretary, he's basically like, okay, well, let's figure out this corruption and let's actually fight within our own damn political party, and the Republican Party specifically, to effectively end up just let's take down this corruption, okay, and let's just get it over with, and let's just do it, and we'll have more power for our specific side, which is the much more liberal side, the much more half-breed kind of individuals, but not really half-breeds, if I'm going to be 100% honest. And this is my own personal view. The half-breeds weren't really half-breeds. They were just more... They wanted some civil service reform, but also just more power in their own control. And that's the thing. People need to understand, too, is like political parties and factions, etc., etc. It's all about power. It's very rare that you actually have genuine, political ideologies of either side. More so on the left, but both sides that ultimately, it's all about power. It really is. For better or worse, it's always about power. And just so happened that, I guess you could say, in a lot of ways, the liberal wing of the Republican Party had a lot of power, and they're going to attack the corruption that was going on within the civil service reform. I mean, they were going to create their own corruption, but, politics, am I right? So from the very get-go, it's very hostile, and it's very antagonistic. He wanted to basically use the civil service reform within the New York Port of Customs, etc., to really be the landmark example of actual reform. And this is one of those things where it's like, if I can just do one thing, I'm gonna do this. In a president's term, and things were going not so good for Chester A. Arthur. Investigations were begun, and things were looking not so good. Special counsel, ultimately of like independent individuals, or supposedly independent individuals, went into investigating the books, investigating every aspect of the Customs House, and they found interesting things. First and foremost, that there was blatant political favoritism, blatant patronage of specific appointments, the kickbacks that they would get, the overwhelming levels of bribery. They found everything, every little nook and cranny, and above all else, they were overstaffed. Yeah, that was one thing that one of the book's notes, is that they were overstaffed. It's like, you have like 80 more people than you really need to. You're wasting the taxpayer dollars, although they don't care, because it's the federal government. Ultimately, things started going very south immediately. You have to understand, this is around 1877, 1878. This is the very beginning of Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency. Once they had this information, Rutherford B. Hayes, Sherman, a whole bunch of different individuals, they basically just went to ham. They asked for Arthur's resignation. They basically said, "Hey, if you give us your resignation, we'll give you we'll let you go overseas and be a representative of the United States, effectively. You'll be God, I'm blanking on the name right now of what it is. You'll be the minister, not the minister, but you know what I mean. You'll be the guy who's going to represent the United States and all our political dealings overseas." Excuse me, diplomat. Sorry, that's the word I'm trying to look for. Anyways, Conkling and Arthur, especially, but mainly Conkling, specifically, this was not good. There was a lot of power that they had within the country, within the federal government, and a lot of money to be lost, and a lot of influence, specifically, that they were going to fight this tooth and nail. And basically, for the better part of a year or two, they just went to town. First, it goes to the Senate specifically, or first is like just investigations, arguing, debates, etc. Yeah, you did this, you did that. I was like, well, you guys didn't stop this. Yeah, whatever. Whole point being that it's a lot of fighting, and then it goes into the actual Senate themselves. Conkling ultimately did have a lot of influence within the United States Senate. What was it? Actually, I think he actually... No, sorry. Which just shows you the level of corruption in this country. Pardon my language. Conkling himself actually was the chairman of the Senate's Commerce Committee, which I think is really just blows my mind. He's like, again, I don't even know how that specifically happened, but ultimately Conkling having a lot of influence, a lot of power, is literally overseeing the Senate hearing that is actually going on about him and Arthur's dealings for the most part. And as you can tell, the Senate rejects the vote, or rejects the whole issue, the whole patronage issue of, I think the vote was like 30 to 26, I believe. But ultimately, at least for now, Rutherford B. Hayes could not stop the Conkling machine. It would only be after a couple more years of Arthur just basically waiting, doing his thing, and still basically just doing the whole corrupt issue. I guess you could say the whole corrupt issue, but he's just doing his thing, politically speaking, and making a lot of money for Conkling and the Republican Party. That it was during a recess within the federal government that Rutherford B. Hayes ultimately ends up basically taking away Arthur's power, and ultimately ends up, well, first off, he suspended him after Congress had adjourned in the summer, and after after being suspended and the reality that he probably wasn't going to get that position back, Arthur basically just gave up trying, because Conkling had other plans in mind for the most part. And Conkling, like I said, he's a very fascinating dude, and he's thinking like 5 steps ahead in such weird ways for control of the Republican Party. So once once Arthur's out of out of his specific position, things are going to be very interesting. Another election's coming up. Rutherford B. Hayes he's openly said he will not run for a second term, and Garfield's this weird half-breed, but there's some political bias with Garfield, and he has a lot of political influence, a lot of political power. He has a lot of push and pull. He knows that New York, if it is going to vote red for James A. Garfield, it's gonna have to go through Conkling, whether it's through political means, corruption, etc., ballot stuffing, whatever you want to call it. Garfield's really gonna have to bend the knee for Roscoe Conkling. And Roscoe Conkling, around 1879, 1880, when the election's about to come up, he basically just states and says, give Chester A. Arthur your vice presidency. This will be the compromise, ultimately. Garfield is going to relent. And before I get into the whole presidential election, etc., Chester A. Arthur's just vibing. He's in a lot of ways trying to figure out what he's going to be doing now. And he's just like, ooh, okay, am I going to do this? Am I going to... He really... There's a lot of turmoil. He held this position for 10 years, a lot of money. You have to understand, a lot of these people's eyes, too, they don't think they're being corrupt actors. They totally are, but and I'm not saying that Chester Arthur thought he was always a good person or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. My whole point, though, is that you can think you're doing the right thing for people, and ultimately you just you just need to take a step back and just ask, am I actually helping people? And Chester Arthur couldn't take a step back sometimes. And for a lot of these presidents and a lot of these individuals, politicians, just human beings in general, it's really difficult to come and really just look at yourself as objectively as you humanly can, logically. Am I actually affecting these people in a much more positive way than I probably... And for Chester Arthur, especially with the rough relationship with his family, it's kind of improving, especially around this point in time. Now that he's home, he has some money, and there's potential political aspirations that he could be a part of that's going to be relatively relaxed in many ways. I mean, he's potentially going to be the vice president, in which case the vice president really doesn't do as much, and it's very clear that his specific position ultimately is going to be, just for the most part, much more ceremonial. It's not like he's going to be able to do anything. And I understand how crazy it is, too. I'm not saying you have to hold political office in order to be the vice president, but, it's kind of strange, that, like, okay, I'm literally, I've had no political office. I'll be the number 2 in the country, technically, in terms of the ascension to the presidency. And I find that really strange and really weird, even for this era, for this time. Interesting. anyways, Arthur's basically just chilling. He's vibing. And then next thing you know, Conkling's going to come in and he's going to be like, so, are you going to be, the vice president? Because, they wanted ultimately the success of the Republican Party. And, say what you will about Rutherford B. Hayes and his presidency. In a lot of ways, you could say the populist movement really begins because of Rutherford B. Hayes and all the things that are happening. But ultimately, it was going to be difficult for the Republicans to win the election if there wasn't any party unity between the half-breeds and specifically the stalwarts. And if you can have basically the second best man excuse me, of the Republican Party within the stalwart faction to join the half-breeds, that's great. Anyways, basically Chester A. Arthur, begrudgingly, but and willfully so because of the strength of the Republican Party, wanted the Republican Party to ultimately succeed, is going to be James A. Garfield's vice president.